Wealthy socialite insulted taxi driver, but his daughter turned out to be the judge in his divorce trial. Before we begin, leave a comment telling us which city you're watching from. And at the end, don't forget to rate this story from 0 to 10. Enjoy the story. Richard Thompson adjusted his platinum Rolex as he stepped out of his penthouse elevator, the marble floors of the lobby gleaming beneath his handmade Italian leather shoes. At 52, Richard had built an empire in real estate development, his name gracing the sides of gleaming skyscrapers throughout the city. His wife, Victoria, followed behind him, her designer heels clicking against the marble like a metronome of wealth. "The gala tonight will be perfect for announcing our new development project," Victoria said, checking her reflection in the polished elevator doors. Her blonde hair was perfectly coiffed, her dress worth more than most people's monthly salary. "The mayor will be there, and Senator Williams promised to make an appearance." Richard nodded absently, his mind already calculating the potential profits from the Riverside development that would displace 3 low-income neighborhoods. To him, the families living there were merely obstacles to be removed, numbers on a spreadsheet rather than human beings with hopes and dreams. The couple had been married for 25 years, though their relationship had long since cooled into a business partnership of sorts. Victoria enjoyed the status and luxury that came with being Mrs. Richard Thompson, while Richard appreciated having a beautiful, socially connected wife who could help him navigate the upper echelons of society. Their only child, Sarah, had been a disappointment to Richard. Instead of joining the family business or marrying into another wealthy family, she had pursued law, eventually becoming a judge. Richard found her career choice baffling. Why serve the public when you could rule over it? He rarely spoke to Sarah anymore, their relationship strained by years of disagreements over values and priorities. "The car should be here any moment," Victoria said, peering through the floor-to-ceiling windows of their building's lobby. "I specifically requested the Bentley tonight. Image is everything at these events." Richard straightened his bow tie and checked his phone. The stock market had been kind to him today, adding another 100,000 to his portfolio. Life was good when you were Richard Thompson, or so he believed. He had no idea that this evening would set in motion a chain of events that would ultimately bring his carefully constructed world crashing down around him. Outside, rain began to fall against the windows, creating rivulets that distorted the city lights beyond. Neither Richard nor Victoria paid any attention to the weather. After all, they would be traveling in climate-controlled luxury, insulated from the harsh realities that affected ordinary people. The doorman approached them with a slight bow. "Mr. and Mrs. Thompson, I'm afraid there's been a slight delay with your usual driver. He's caught in traffic due to an accident on 5th Avenue. However, I've arranged for an alternative." Richard's face darkened. He despised disruptions to his perfectly planned schedule. "What kind of alternative?" "A taxi, sir. The driver is already waiting outside." Victoria gasped as if the doorman had suggested they walk. "A taxi? Richard, we cannot arrive at the Metropolitan Club in a common taxi." But Richard was already calculating. They were running late, and making an entrance at the right moment was crucial for his business dealings tonight. "Fine," he said through gritted teeth. "But this better be clean." As they walked toward the exit, Richard's mind was already focused on the evening ahead, the deals to be made, the hands to be shaken, the image to be projected. He had no way of knowing that the seemingly insignificant decision to take a taxi would change everything. The yellow taxi sat idling outside the luxury building, its windshield wipers fighting against the steady rain. Behind the wheel sat David Miller, a man whose weathered hands told the story of 30 years driving through the city's streets. At 55, David had seen it all: late-night drunks, early morning commuters, tourists with impossible directions, and occasionally, passengers like the ones approaching his cab. David had been driving taxi for most of his adult life, not by choice but by necessity. He'd once been a construction foreman, but a back injury had ended that career. With bills to pay and a daughter to put through college, he'd taken to the streets, working 12-hour shifts to make ends meet. His daughter Sarah was his pride and joy, the first in their family to graduate from college, let alone law school. She'd worked her way through school with scholarships, part-time jobs, and an unwavering determination that reminded David of his late wife. Sarah had recently been appointed as a family court judge, an achievement that filled David with more pride than he could express. As Richard and Victoria Thompson approached his taxi, David straightened in his seat. He could tell immediately they were wealthy. Their clothes, their posture, the way the doorman treated them all spoke of money and privilege. David had learned to read people quickly in his line of work. It was a survival skill. Richard opened the rear door and slid in, followed by Victoria, who immediately began inspecting the interior with barely concealed disgust. "The Metropolitan Club," Richard announced without looking at David, his tone suggesting he was addressing a servant rather than a person. "Yes, sir," David replied politely, pulling away from the curb. The rain had intensified, making visibility difficult and slowing traffic throughout the downtown area. David drove carefully, knowing that the wet roads could be treacherous, especially with precious cargo like this. "Can't you go any faster?" Richard demanded after they'd been in traffic for 5 minutes. "I have very important people waiting for me." "I'm sorry, sir, but the rain has slowed everything down. There was also an accident on 5th Avenue that's backing up traffic," David explained, glancing in the rearview mirror at his passenger's increasingly agitated face. Victoria chimed in, her voice dripping with disdain. "This is exactly why we don't take taxis. Richard, this is humiliating. What if someone sees us?" David kept his eyes on the road, having learned long ago not to take such comments personally. He'd heard worse from passengers who seemed to think his profession made him less than human. Still, it stung. He thought of Sarah, probably working late in her chambers, preparing for tomorrow's cases, making a real difference in people's lives. "Look," Richard said, leaning forward, "I don't care about your excuses. I need to be at the Metropolitan Club in 10 minutes, not 20. Figure it out." The words hung in the air like the humidity from the rain outside, creating an uncomfortable tension in the small space of the taxi. David simply nodded and continued driving, professional as always, unaware that sitting behind him was a man whose life would soon intersect with his own in the most unexpected way. The traffic had crawled to a complete standstill, red taillights stretching ahead like a river of frustration. Richard Thompson's patience, never his strongest virtue, had completely evaporated. He drummed his manicured fingers against the leather armrest of the taxi, his jaw clenched tight enough to crack walnuts. "This is ridiculous," he muttered, then raised his voice. "Driver, I thought I made myself clear. I have extremely important business tonight. Can't you take a different route?" David Miller glanced in his rearview mirror, maintaining his professional composure despite the growing hostility from his passenger. "Sir, every route to the Metropolitan Club is blocked right now due to the accident. I've been driving these streets for 30 years, and I know every shortcut. We're taking the fastest possible route under these conditions." 30 years. Richard scoffed, his voice taking on a cruel edge. 30 years of driving a taxi? Well, that certainly explains the incompetence. If you had any real skills or ambition, you wouldn't be stuck in this dead-end job, would you? Victoria smirked, joining in on her husband's verbal assault. "Really, darling, what did we expect? It's not like we're dealing with someone who understands the value of time or success." David's hands tightened on the steering wheel, but he said nothing. He thought of his daughter Sarah, probably still at the courthouse, working on cases that would help families in crisis. She'd taught him that dignity came from within, not from what others thought of you. But Richard wasn't finished. The stress of the delayed evening, combined with his natural arrogance, had unleashed something ugly within him. "I suppose this is what happens when you settle for mediocrity. Tell me, driver, what's the highest level of education you achieved? Did you even finish high school?" "Richard," Victoria said with mock concern, "don't be too hard on him. Not everyone can be successful. Some people are just meant to serve others." The words hit David like physical blows. He had indeed finished high school, barely, while working part-time to help support his sick mother. College had been a dream he couldn't afford, especially after his wife died young and left him raising Sarah alone. Every choice he'd made had been about providing for his daughter, about giving her the opportunities he'd never had. "You know what your problem is?" Richard continued, emboldened by his wife's laughter. "You lack vision. You lack drive. You're content to sit behind the wheel of this pathetic excuse for a vehicle, picking up scraps from people like us. No wonder you'll never amount to anything." The taxi inched forward in the traffic, windshield wipers rhythmically clearing the rain that seemed to echo David's mood. He wanted to respond, to defend himself, to explain that driving a taxi had put his daughter through law school, that he'd sacrificed his own comfort for her success. But he'd learned that engaging with passengers like this only made things worse. "I bet your children are just as unsuccessful as you are," Richard added with particular venom. "Failure tends to run in families, doesn't it? Like father, like child." That comment cut the deepest. If Richard had known that David's daughter was one of the most respected judges in the city, known for her fairness, intelligence, and integrity, he might have chosen his words more carefully. But Richard Thompson had never bothered to learn about the lives of the people he considered beneath him. The traffic finally began to move, and David pressed gently on the accelerator, bringing them closer to their destination and, unknowingly, closer to a future reckoning that would turn Richard's world upside down. The Metropolitan Club loomed ahead through the rain-streaked windshield, its elegant facade glowing with warm light from within. The exclusive venue had been hosting the city's elite for over a century, its membership list reading like a who's who of power and influence. Tonight was the annual charity gala, though for most attendees, charity was secondary to networking and social positioning. David pulled up to the club's covered entrance, where uniformed valets waited to assist guests. The ride that had felt eternal in the suffocating tension of Richard's insults had finally come to an end. David's meter read $28.50, a modest fare for what had felt like the longest journey of his professional career. Richard threw a 20 and a 10 onto the front seat without ceremony. "Keep the change," he said dismissively, as if bestowing a great favor. The tip was adequate by standard measures, but his tone suggested he was being extraordinarily generous to someone so far beneath his station. As Richard and Victoria emerged from the taxi, Richard couldn't resist one final insult. He leaned down to David's window, which David had lowered slightly. "You know, driver, I hope this evening has been educational for you. Maybe you've learned something about what success actually looks like." Victoria laughed, linking her arm through her husband's. "Come along, Richard. We shouldn't keep important people waiting because of—" She gestured vaguely at the taxi. "This." David watched them walk through the club's ornate entrance, Richard's chest puffed with self-importance, Victoria's head held high with practiced arrogance. The doorman greeted them with the deference reserved for the wealthy and influential, their names probably already known and their preferences memorized. As David prepared to pull away from the curb, he allowed himself a moment of quiet reflection. He thought about Sarah, who at this very moment was probably reviewing case files in her study, preparing to help families navigate the most difficult times of their lives. She'd taught him that true worth wasn't measured in bank accounts or social status, but in how you treated others, especially those who couldn't do anything for you in return. The irony wasn't lost on him. Richard Thompson, in all his wealth and arrogance, had no idea that the failure he'd just insulted was the father of someone who held real power, the power to make decisions that could affect lives, including, potentially, his own. David picked up his radio to notify dispatch that he was available for the next fare. The night was still young, and there were more passengers to serve, more stories to unfold in the back seat of his humble taxi. Some would be kind, others indifferent, and a few, like Richard Thompson, would be cruel. But David had learned to take them all in stride. As he drove away from the Metropolitan Club, David had no way of knowing that fate was already weaving a web that would soon entangle the arrogant man who had just humiliated him. Sometimes the universe has a sense of justice that operates on timelines beyond human understanding, and sometimes the most powerful lessons come to those who believe themselves untouchable. The rain continued to fall, washing the city clean, preparing it for whatever tomorrow might bring. 3 months after the taxi ride, Richard Thompson's life began to unravel with the slow inevitability of a building with a compromised foundation. It started with small signs: Victoria's increasing coldness, mysterious phone calls she'd taken private, and her sudden interest in girls' trips that lasted longer than usual. Richard, absorbed in his latest development project, initially dismissed these changes. Victoria had always been somewhat aloof, and he attributed her behavior to the stress of planning their upcoming 25th anniversary party. He was far too important, too successful, too invincible to consider that his marriage might be crumbling. The revelation came on a Tuesday morning in his corner office, 40 floors above the city streets. Richard was reviewing architectural plans when his secretary, Helen, knocked hesitantly on his door. Her usually composed demeanor seemed shaken, and she held a manila envelope with the gravity of someone handling dynamite. "Mr. Thompson," she said carefully, "this was just delivered by a legal courier. It requires your immediate attention." Richard barely looked up from his blueprints. "Put it with the other contracts, Helen. I'll review it later." "Sir, I think you should read this now," Helen insisted, placing the envelope directly in front of him. "It's from Morrison, Clark & Associates." The name of the prestigious law firm made Richard pause. Morrison, Clark & Associates was known for handling high-profile divorces for the city's elite. A cold realization began to creep up his spine as he tore open the envelope. The papers inside were crisp, official, and devastating. "Petition for dissolution of marriage," read the header in bold, unforgiving letters. "Victoria Elizabeth Thompson versus Richard James Thompson." The words seemed to swim before his eyes as he scanned the document, each line more shocking than the last. Victoria was seeking not just a divorce, but a significant portion of his assets. She claimed irreconcilable differences, emotional neglect, and, most damaging of all, evidence of financial improprieties in his business dealings. The petition suggested she had been gathering evidence for months, possibly years. Richard's hands trembled as he read further. Victoria's lawyers had done their homework thoroughly. They had documentation of his offshore accounts, records of tax avoidance schemes, and evidence of bribes paid to city officials for favorable zoning decisions. Information that could ruin him financially and potentially land him in prison. His phone buzzed with a text message from Victoria. "Don't bother coming home tonight. My lawyers will be in touch to arrange retrieval of your personal belongings. This marriage is over, Richard. I'm done being married to a man who treats everyone around him like garbage." The irony was bitter. Richard had always prided himself on his ability to control every aspect of his life, to manipulate people and situations to his advantage. Now, the person closest to him had turned that strategy against him, and he found himself completely outmaneuvered. He tried calling Victoria, but her phone went straight to voicemail. He tried calling her friends, but they claimed ignorance or simply hung up. The social network he thought he controlled had apparently chosen sides, and they hadn't chosen his. That evening, Richard found himself in a hotel suite, staring out at the city he'd helped shape, wondering how everything had gone so wrong so quickly. The rain that had fallen the night he'd insulted the taxi driver was falling again, as if the universe was washing away the last remnants of his old life. Richard Thompson had not built his empire by accepting defeat gracefully. Within 24 hours of receiving the divorce papers, he had assembled a legal team that rivaled a small army. His lead attorney, Charles Whitman, was known throughout the city as a ruthless advocate for wealthy men seeking to protect their assets during divorce proceedings. "We can fight this, Richard," Whitman assured him during their emergency meeting. "Victoria may have gathered some concerning information, but we have resources at our disposal. We'll challenge every claim, question every document, and make this as difficult for her as possible." Richard nodded grimly, his confidence slowly returning. This was what he understood, warfare disguised as legal proceedings. He would use every advantage his wealth and connections could provide. "I want to know everything about her lawyer, everything about her new living situation, and everything about how she gathered this so-called evidence." What Richard didn't know was that Victoria had chosen her legal representation just as carefully as he had. Jennifer Morrison, the senior partner at Morrison, Clark & Associates, had built her reputation destroying the cases of men exactly like Richard Thompson. She was methodical, thorough, and utterly uncompromising when it came to protecting her clients' interests. The war began immediately. Richard's team filed counter-motions challenging Victoria's right to half of his assets, claiming that her lifestyle during their marriage proved she had been well compensated for any sacrifices she'd made. They questioned her mental fitness, her motivations, and her evidence. Victoria's team responded by releasing carefully curated information to the press. Suddenly, Richard found himself the subject of newspaper articles questioning his business practices. Headlines like "Real Estate Mogul's Empire Built on Questionable Foundations" began appearing in the business section, each story chipping away at his carefully constructed public image. The social consequences were swift and brutal. Invitations to exclusive events stopped arriving. Business partners began distancing themselves, claiming concerns about their own reputations. The mayor, who had once eagerly attended Richard's fundraisers, suddenly became unavailable for meetings. Most damaging of all, several of Richard's development projects came under increased scrutiny from city regulators. Permits that had once been rubber-stamped were now subjected to intensive review. Environmental groups that had previously been ignored suddenly found their concerns being taken seriously by city officials. Richard's lawyers assured him that this was all temporary, that public attention would eventually move on to other scandals. But privately, Charles Whitman was beginning to worry. Victoria's evidence was more comprehensive than he'd initially believed, and her legal team was proving to be formidable opponents. "We need to consider a settlement," Whitman suggested during one of their strategy meetings. "A controlled negotiation might be preferable to a public trial." "Absolutely not," Richard snarled. "I won't give that woman one penny more than I have to. She thinks she can destroy me? She has no idea who she's dealing with." But Victoria knew exactly who she was dealing with. She'd been married to Richard for 25 years, had watched him crush competitors and exploit workers, had seen him treat service staff like invisible obstacles to his comfort. She knew his weaknesses, his pressure points, and his deepest fears. The case was assigned to family court, and both sides prepared for what promised to be a lengthy, expensive, and very public battle. Neither Richard nor Victoria could have imagined that the judge who would ultimately decide their fate was already connected to their story in the most unexpected way possible. The wheels of justice began to turn, slowly but inexorably, toward a reckoning that would teach Richard Thompson the most expensive lesson of his life. Sarah Miller had always known she wanted to be a judge, even as a little girl watching court proceedings on television while her father worked his second job. She'd seen how the law could be either a shield for the powerful or a sword for justice, and she'd dedicated her life to ensuring it served the latter purpose. At 31, Judge Sarah Miller was one of the youngest appointees to the family court bench in the city's history. Her appointment had come after years of distinguished service as a public defender, where she'd built a reputation for thorough preparation, fair treatment of all parties, and an unwavering commitment to justice over convenience. The courthouse where she worked was a far cry from the gleaming towers of her father's taxi routes. Built in the 1920s, it was a temple to justice with marble columns, high ceilings, and an atmosphere of solemn dignity. Sarah's chambers were modest but comfortable, lined with law books and legal precedents that she consulted regularly. She'd inherited her father's work ethic and her late mother's sense of fairness. Every case that came before her bench received the same careful attention, whether it involved wealthy socialites or working-class families struggling to make ends meet. She believed deeply that in her courtroom, justice was truly blind to social status and bank account balances. On the morning she received the case file for Thompson versus Thompson, Sarah was reviewing her docket for the week. High-asset divorce cases were unfortunately common in her court, usually involving couples whose marriages had become business arrangements that one party or both wished to dissolve. As she opened the file, the name Richard Thompson seemed vaguely familiar, though she couldn't immediately place why. The case appeared to be particularly contentious, with both sides represented by top-tier legal firms and accusations flying in both directions. The financial stakes were enormous. Richard's net worth was estimated at over $50 million. Sarah read through the initial filings carefully, noting the allegations of financial misconduct, emotional abuse, and marital breakdown. Victoria Thompson's petition painted a picture of a man who had become increasingly cold and controlling over the years, treating his wife more like an accessory than a partner. Richard's counterfilings portrayed Victoria as a gold digger who had enjoyed the benefits of his success for decades and was now attempting to destroy him out of spite. His lawyers argued that she had no legal right to assets she hadn't helped create, and that her claims of abuse were exaggerated for financial gain. What struck Sarah most about the case files was the complete absence of any mention of children. After 25 years of marriage, Richard and Victoria Thompson appeared to have no shared children, no grandchildren, no family ties that might complicate the dissolution of their union. It seemed like a purely financial arrangement coming to its inevitable end. Sarah scheduled the first hearing for the following week, giving both sides time to prepare their arguments. She had no idea that she was about to preside over a case involving the man who had once sat in her father's taxi and delivered insults that still echoed in David Miller's memory. The law, Sarah had learned, had a way of creating unexpected connections and delivering justice in the most surprising ways. Sometimes the very people who believed themselves above consequences found themselves answering to forces they'd never considered. As she prepared for the Thompson case, Sarah couldn't have imagined that this divorce proceeding would become one of the most personally meaningful cases of her career, or that it would finally give her father the vindication he'd never sought but thoroughly deserved. The first hearing in Thompson versus Thompson was scheduled for a gray Thursday morning, the kind of day when the courthouse's fluorescent lights seemed particularly harsh against the granite walls. Richard Thompson arrived with his legal team in a convoy of black cars, dressed in his most expensive suit and projecting the confidence of a man who believed money could buy any outcome. He'd spent the morning briefing with Charles Whitman, reviewing their strategy to paint Victoria as a vengeful ex-wife seeking to punish him for her own failings. They'd prepared character witnesses, financial experts, and a narrative designed to present Richard as the victim of a calculated attack on his life's work. Remember, Whitman had advised, judges respond to respect and authority. You're not just another defendant. You're a pillar of this community, a job creator, a philanthropist. Carry yourself accordingly. Richard entered the courtroom with that advice ringing in his ears. The family court was smaller than he'd expected, more intimate, with wooden benches and a raised judge's bench that dominated the room. As he took his seat at the defendant's table, he barely glanced at the bailiff announcing the session. All rise for the Honorable Judge Sarah Miller. Richard stood with everyone else, his attention focused on organizing his notes and projecting confidence for the proceeding ahead. It wasn't until Judge Miller had taken her seat and called the court to order that he looked up at the bench. The moment their eyes met, Sarah felt a jolt of recognition, though she couldn't immediately place where she'd seen this man before. There was something familiar about his arrogant posture, his dismissive expression, the way he seemed to look through people rather than at them. For Richard, the recognition was slower to come. Judge Miller appeared professional and composed, her dark hair pulled back, her expression neutral but alert. She was younger than he'd expected, but carried herself with the authority that came with her position. We're here today for the initial hearing in the matter of Thompson versus Thompson, Judge Miller announced, her voice clear and confident. Before we proceed with opening statements, I want to make clear that this court operates under principles of fairness and respect for all parties involved. As she spoke, something in her cadence, something in the careful way she chose her words, triggered a memory in Richard's mind. The voice was different, more educated, more refined, but there was an underlying quality that seemed familiar. It wasn't until Judge Miller mentioned reviewing the financial documents that Richard's blood ran cold. She had the same thoughtful way of speaking that he'd heard before, the same measured tone that suggested careful consideration of facts and circumstances. Your Honor, Charles Whitman began, rising to address the court. My client, Mr. Richard Thompson, is a respected businessman and community leader. But Richard barely heard his lawyer's words. His mind was racing back to that rainy night 3 months ago, to the taxi ride that had seemed so insignificant at the time. He was beginning to remember the driver's voice, the man he'd insulted and berated, the person he'd dismissed as a failure whose children would follow in his unsuccessful footsteps. The pieces were clicking into place with horrifying clarity. The taxi driver's name had been David, and he'd mentioned having a daughter. Richard's stomach began to churn as he realized the impossible coincidence that was unfolding before him. Judge Sarah Miller, the woman who would decide his financial future, might very well be the daughter of the man he'd treated with such cruelty just months earlier. The man whose parenting he'd mocked, whose ambition he'd questioned, whose very worth as a human being he'd dismissed. As his lawyer continued to present his case, Richard Thompson realized that his words in that taxi had come back to haunt him in the most devastating way possible. Sarah Miller maintained her judicial composure throughout the first day of hearings, but that evening in her chambers, she couldn't shake the feeling that she'd seen Richard Thompson before. His arrogant demeanor, his dismissive attitude toward court staff, and the way he seemed to look down on everyone around him triggered a nagging sense of familiarity. It wasn't until she was driving home that the memory crystallized. She was stopped at a red light when she saw a taxi in the next lane, and suddenly she was transported back to a conversation she'd had with her father several months earlier. David Miller had come home unusually quiet that night. more subdued than she'd seen him in years. When Sarah had pressed him about his day, he'd reluctantly shared the story of particularly cruel passengers who had spent the entire ride insulting him, questioning his intelligence, his ambition, and even his worth as a father. They said failure runs in families. Her father had told her, his voice heavy with hurt. They said my children would probably be just as unsuccessful as me. Sarah had been furious, but her father had asked her not to pursue it. It's just words, sweetheart. I've heard worse. Besides, people like that get what's coming to them eventually. Now, sitting in her car as the light turned green, Sarah realized that eventually had arrived. Richard Thompson was the man who had insulted her father, and fate had placed his future directly in her hands. The ethical implications hit her immediately. As a judge, she had a duty to recuse herself from any case where she had a personal interest or bias. The law was clear on this point, and her legal training screamed at her to step aside and allow another judge to handle the Thompson divorce. But as she drove through the same streets her father navigated every day, Sarah found herself thinking about justice in its broader sense. Richard Thompson had built his wealth by exploiting others, by treating working people as disposable obstacles to his comfort. He'd shown no remorse for his cruelty, no recognition that his words could hurt real people with real feelings. That night, Sarah called her father. Dad, do you remember telling me about some passengers who were particularly rude to you a few months ago? A wealthy couple going to the Metropolitan Club. David was quiet for a moment. Why do you ask, honey? I think one of them might be appearing in my court. Richard Thompson, does that name mean anything to you? The silence stretched long enough that Sarah wondered if the call had dropped. Finally, David spoke. Yes, that was him. But Sarah, you need to be careful. I don't want my problems affecting your career. Dad, this isn't about your problems. This is about a man who needs to learn that actions have consequences, even for the wealthy and powerful. Sarah, David said firmly, you're a judge because you're fair and honest. Don't let his cruelty turn you into something you're not. His words hit home. Sarah realized she was at a crossroads that would define not just this case, but her integrity as a jurist. She could recuse herself and maintain perfect ethical standards, or she could find a way to ensure that Richard Thompson finally faced accountability for his behavior. The decision she made would test everything she believed about justice, fairness, and the responsibility that came with power. In her father's taxi, Richard had felt free to be cruel because he believed there would be no consequences. Now, Sarah held the power to prove him wrong, but she would have to do it the right way, within the bounds of the law and her judicial oath. The question was whether justice and ethics could coexist in this particular case. The Thompson divorce trial had stretched over 6 weeks, becoming one of the most closely watched family court cases in recent memory. The media had dubbed it the Socialite Showdown, and courthouse reporters filled the gallery each day, documenting every revelation and legal maneuver. Judge Sarah Miller had decided not to recuse herself, but she'd made that decision based on careful legal research and consultation with judicial ethics experts. Since Richard's insults to her father had not been directed at her personally and didn't involve the legal matters at hand, she could proceed as long as she maintained absolute impartiality. And impartial she had been. Sarah had ruled in Richard's favor on several motions, denying Victoria's attempts to freeze all of his assets and allowing him to continue operating his business during the proceedings. Her fairness had been so scrupulous that Richard's own lawyers had begun to relax, believing they were before a judge who wouldn't let personal feelings influence her decisions. The turning point came when Victoria's lawyers presented evidence of Richard's business practices, the bribes, the tax evasion, the deliberate displacement of low-income families for profit. Richard had built his fortune by stepping on others, and the documentation was devastating. But it was Richard's own testimony that sealed his fate. Under oath, his arrogance couldn't be contained. When asked about his treatment of employees and service workers, he replied with the same dismissive attitude that had characterized his taxi ride months earlier. I don't have time to coddle every worker who might have hurt feelings, Richard testified. Successful people understand that business requires difficult decisions. Those who can't handle that level of reality should find other work. Jennifer Morrison, Victoria's lawyer, had done her homework. Mr. Thompson, would you say this attitude extends to how you treat service workers in your personal life as well? I treat everyone appropriately for their station in life, Richard replied. his words dripping with condescension. It was then that Sarah made her decision, not as the daughter of a taxi driver, but as a judge who had sworn to uphold justice. Richard Thompson had revealed his character under oath, confirming what the evidence already suggested. He was a man who believed his wealth made him superior to others. When the time came for her final ruling, Judge Miller was thorough and methodical. She awarded Victoria 60% of the marital assets, citing Richard's financial misconduct and his pattern of emotional abuse. She ordered him to pay substantial alimony and to cover all of Victoria's legal fees. But more importantly, she forwarded the evidence of his financial crimes to the district attorney's office and reported his business practices to federal tax authorities. Richard Thompson would face consequences beyond his divorce. As court adjourned for the final time, Richard sat stunned in his chair. His empire was crumbling, his reputation destroyed, and criminal charges loomed on the horizon. Everything he'd built through cruelty and exploitation was being taken away. Judge Miller gathered her papers, preparing to leave the bench. As she did, she caught Richard's eye one final time. "Mr. Thompson," she said quietly, "I hope this experience teaches you that everyone deserves to be treated with dignity and respect, regardless of their profession or social status." Richard's face went pale as the words hit him. The careful, measured tone was unmistakable now. This was the voice of the taxi driver's daughter, the failure he'd mocked, the child whose future he'd dismissed. David Miller was waiting outside the courthouse when Sarah emerged. He'd taken the day off work to be there for the verdict, though he'd waited outside rather than enter the courtroom. "How did it go?" he asked, though her smile had already given him the answer. "Justice was served, Dad. Sometimes the system actually works the way it's supposed to." As they walked together toward David's car, he'd driven himself today rather than take a taxi. Sarah reflected on the strange paths that life sometimes takes. Richard Thompson had believed his wealth made him untouchable, that he could treat others cruelly without consequence. He'd learned, in the most expensive way possible, that kindness costs nothing, but cruelty can cost everything. And sometimes, the children of the people you dismiss grow up to hold the power to hold you accountable. The rain had stopped, and the sun was beginning to break through the clouds, casting golden light across the courthouse steps. 6 months later, David Miller received an unexpected visitor at his apartment. He opened the door to find Victoria Thompson, though she looked different than the haughty woman who had once sat in his taxi. Her designer clothes had been replaced with simple, elegant attire, and her expression carried a humility that hadn't been there before. "Mr. Miller," she said quietly, "I hope you'll forgive the intrusion. I wanted to speak with you personally." David invited her in, curious about what had brought Richard's ex-wife to his modest home. Victoria looked around the small but tidy apartment, noting the photographs of Sarah's graduation from law school, her judicial appointment ceremony, and various father-daughter moments over the years. "I know what my husband said to you that night," Victoria began, her voice filled with genuine remorse. "I participated in it, and I'm deeply ashamed. You didn't deserve that treatment, and I wanted to apologize personally." David nodded, appreciating her honesty. "That's kind of you to say, Mrs. Thompson." "It's Ms. Johnson now," she corrected with a small smile. "I've gone back to my maiden name. The divorce taught me a lot about who I'd become during my marriage, and I didn't like what I saw." She reached into her purse and pulled out an envelope. "I also wanted to give you this. It's a small gesture, but I hope it means something." Inside the envelope was a check for $50,000. David's eyes widened in surprise. "I don't need charity," he said, trying to hand it back. "It's not charity," Victoria insisted. "During the divorce proceedings, I learned about your daughter's scholarship fund at the law school. This is a donation to that fund, in honor of parents who sacrifice everything to give their children better opportunities. Parents like you." David felt tears welling in his eyes. Sarah had indeed established a scholarship for children of working-class families pursuing legal careers, funded partly by her salary and partly by donations from grateful clients and colleagues. "There's something else," Victoria continued. "I've started a foundation focused on workers' rights and dignity. I'd like to name you to the advisory board, if you're interested. Your experience could help us make sure other service workers don't face the kind of treatment we subjected you to." 3 years later, the David Miller Foundation for Workers' Dignity had become one of the city's most respected advocacy organizations. David had retired from driving taxi and now worked full-time, helping other service workers navigate workplace harassment and discrimination. Richard Thompson, meanwhile, had served 18 months in minimum security prison for tax evasion and bribery. Upon his release, he'd found his business empire gone, his social connections severed, and his reputation in ruins. He'd taken a job as a night security guard at an office building, earning minimum wage and learning, finally, what it meant to work for survival rather than luxury. Judge Sarah Miller continued to serve on the family court bench, her reputation for fairness and compassion growing with each case. She'd handled hundreds of divorces, custody battles, and family disputes, always remembering the lesson her father had taught her, that everyone who entered her courtroom deserved to be treated with dignity. On the 5th anniversary of the Thompson case, Sarah and David were having dinner at their usual restaurant when the server, a young man working his way through college, accidentally spilled water on their table. "I'm so sorry," the young man said, clearly mortified. "I'll get this cleaned up right away." "No worries at all," David said warmly, helping to soak up the spill with his napkin. "These things happen. What's your major at school?" The server's face brightened. "Pre-law, sir. I'm hoping to go to law school after I graduate." Sarah smiled, pulling out her business card. "Give me a call next week. I'd be happy to tell you about some scholarship opportunities that might interest you." As the young man walked away, practically glowing with excitement, David reached across the table and squeezed his daughter's hand. "Your mother would be so proud of who you've become," he said. "She'd be proud of both of us, Dad. We turned something ugly into something beautiful." Outside, the city hummed with its usual energy. Taxis navigated the busy streets, carrying passengers with their own stories, their own struggles, their own dreams. Some passengers would be kind, others indifferent, and a few would be cruel. But in at least this small corner of the world, cruelty had consequences, kindness had rewards, and justice, true justice, had prevailed. The story of Richard Thompson and his taxi ride had become a cautionary tale told in law schools and ethics classes, a reminder that character is revealed not in how we treat our equals, but in how we treat those who can do nothing for us in return. And sometimes, just sometimes, the arc of the moral universe bends toward justice in the most unexpected ways. David Miller had learned that night in his taxi that words could wound, but he'd also learned that his daughter's success was the greatest vindication of all, proof that dignity, hard work, and love for family could triumph over cruelty and arrogance. And Richard Thompson? He'd learned the most expensive lesson of his life, that everyone you meet is fighting a battle you know nothing about, and everyone deserves to be treated with respect. It was a lesson that came too late to save his old life, but perhaps not too late to build a better one. In the end, the wealthy socialite who had insulted a taxi driver discovered that justice doesn't care about your bank account, your social status, or your sense of superiority. Justice cares only about truth, fairness, and the fundamental dignity that belongs to every human being. And sometimes, justice wears the robes of a judge whose father once drove a taxi through the rain-soaked streets of the city, carrying passengers who would never guess that they were in the presence of a man whose love and sacrifice had shaped the woman who would one day hold their fate in her capable, compassionate hands.